So, hello friends, after so long, we are coming out with another lecture on research methodology and research and publication ethics, which is part of in all Indian universities under the UGC umbrella, the compulsory coursework syllabus for all branches of knowledge. Although my lectures are germane to the literary and cultural studies, while we talk about research methodology, a number of tools and concepts are actually not limited within literary studies or cultural studies. And in fact, some of the tools are outright borrowed from some other science or social science-based subjects or areas of study. Today we are going to look into a very important aspect of getting your research methodology correct and getting your observation and recording of the data that you extract from what you observe, namely the samples that you choose from a number of texts or the samples that you choose from a number of folk performances, etc., into accurate inferences. How to do that? One important grid, or let's say one important touchstone of assessing whether you are researching correctly or not is to check whether you are measuring the things correctly. Now, the question that often would, in fact, make the students of literature very uneasy is that measurement apparently is connected to quantity, and in literary and cultural studies we are actually dealing not with quantitative analysis but with qualitative research. So apparently a number of researchers, scholars, even distinguished professors are allergic to the methodology of measurement. But that is only apparently, because you see, measurement doesn't only mean numerical or quantitative analysis. Suppose we are talking about growth of feminism. And when we say growth is something that you are already using a measurement-based term, because growth would definitely mean from less to more. So there is a sense of amount or increment in the records that you extract from your observations and the inferences that you make. Or for example, we were talking about the scarcity of feminist discourses in medieval, let's say, diary texts. When you say scarcity or rarity, then you are actually uttering a term which is already related to a sense of magnitude, a sense of unavailability in terms of amount. So you are already making a statement which is related to measurement. You see, for all qualitative research, scale is absolutely important. Because when you say that, suppose you are doing research on a singular, particular author function, let's say Charles Lamb, and you were suggesting that in his juvenile years he was more full of this type of attributes as a writer, and when he was matured, these attributes changed and newer attributes could be found more in his writings. So this more or less range or spectrum type of information that you are gathering and the inference that you would make from it, they all are based on a scale of measurement, although you are not using units of measurement like a centimeter, liter, or kilogram. You are, of course, making statements about more and less. In fact, if you are talking about more or less occurrence in a particular genre of a particular rhetorical trope or ideological discourse, if you are talking about the scarcity or density of some particular ideological discourse or for some particular type of cultural practices in a particular era or in a particular genre. If you are talking about the the vanishing of a particular type of movement, literary movement, from high popularity to surreptitious performances and finally to almost invisibility, let's say imagism with I capital. From the years 1909 to 1914, it had an ascending scale, and then from 1914 onwards, it started declining. And in 2014, you almost have no imagist left, with the tag imagist uh, in his writing or in his self-fashioning in the literary world. So we were talking about the shrinkage or the vanishing of a particular literary tendency or particular literary movement. You were in all of these types of research objectives, you are actually estimating more, less, growing, shrinking, scarcity, plentifulness. Uh, so you are actually estimating magnitude and the change in magnitude, degree. So you are actually using measurement even as a literary student. In fact, for diachronic studies, which would take the samples not from one particular decade, but over time, and we'll see the trajectory of how the different attributes, let's say some ideological positions like feminism or post-colonial discourses in the text or underlying the lines of the text, or some particular type of hybridity taking place gradually over the years, and finally the hybrid replacing the pure, and how the definition of English is changing, for example, from Queen's English to Indian Englishes. You will, of course, use a time series data. Of course, not like the science students who would take a graph of x-axis as passage of time, and y-axis as a kind of measuring in terms of representation on the graph paper of how high the columns are becoming of a particular feature. Of course, you will not do that type of quantitative analysis, but whenever you are making a diachronic study with historical sense of growth, change, modification of particular object of study over the time, over different periods, over different decades, over different centuries, over different epistemes, of course you are using measurement even without understanding it in your consciousness. So now that I have already opened your eyes towards the acknowledgement that without measuring overtly, like a scientist in a laboratory, even a literary student in whatever research he or she is engaged in is indulging into some form of cognitive and observational and inferential practices which involve measurement. Now, we have to understand the definition of measurement for the literary and cultural students, for the research scholars of literature and cultural studies. What is measurement for students of literature, students of cultural studies? To observe, to record, and then to conceptually scale. Here is the difference with the scientists, that they would have quantitative data and they will scale quantitatively, but we always make a qualitative scale. So to observe, to record, and to scale how the concept that you have put in your research question, how the variable with which you are working operates magnitudinally within the time and space range that you have defined in your title. That particular system of observing and recording and scaling the operational magnitudinal definition of concepts before making inferences and conclusions from your observed data is called measurement. Now, how do we measure in literary and cultural studies? This is a very important thing to note, that whenever you are making a statement about the presence of something, for example, the presence of medievalism in Coleridge, although Coleridge was not born in the medieval era, he was born in the Romantic era, he was writing in the Romantic era, but in most of his poems we would find the presence of medievalism. So you are measuring a degree or extent, which is of course a magnitudinal term, the presence of medieval qualities within the 19th century writings of Coleridge. Or if we were talking about absence, for example, the absence of any types of misogyny in the writings of Margaret Atwood, that she is not subscribing to any form of misogynic practices, and therefore in some novels she would even reject, for example in Surfacing, she would even reject the male-dominated grammar and patriarchal norms of language, and at the end you find that there is a total absence of any patriarchal discourses, as the anonymous protagonist of the novel Surfacing is gradually become not only away from male-dominated human society, male-dominated human city, male-dominated human habits, but also male-dominated grammar. And so the language of the text is also suggesting an absence of any grammar, male-dominated grammar in it, gradually as the novel progresses. So if you are measuring some presence, some absence, or the way in which partial presence and partial absence, this ratio is changing over the pages of a text, over the years in a decade, or over decades in a century, or over generic variations, let's say from fairy tales to folk tales to highly sophisticated capitalist ventures like filmic representations and cinematic representations of these. Whenever you're talking about presence and absence, you are measuring. Whenever you are seeing fluctuation, ascendancy, descendancy, a gradation in a range, the degree of density, intensity, and scattering. Suppose you are talking about post-colonial concept of homeland in the novels of, let's say, any post-colonial writer, you would find that in certain places of the text there is a very concentrated nostalgia for a homeland, which is half imaginary and half mnemonic. And then you would find that as the character, and let's say the characters in plural, in that particular text, they are accommodating themselves to the newer climates and newer horizons of existence in new lands, new cultures, how they're jostling their shoulders against unhomely or newer or strange things, practices, beliefs, habits, objects, seductions, compulsions, etc., and how the concentrated pages on home and the scattered, diffused, radically hybridizing narrative parts in that novel related to the scattering or diffusion of that home into newer homes which are not so homely maybe. That particular binary between concentrated nostalgia for a home, however imaginary, and diffusion amid the new land where the home isn't ever home enough. That scattering, that concentration and scattering, they are juxtaposed in any post-colonial diasporic narrative like a binary opposition, and that is a thematic opposition always to be found in the diasporic text. So you are measuring the not only density and pages and scattering of pages of the concept of homeland, of the concept of purity versus hybridity, but you are also comparing and contrasting the scales of density of homeland and the scattering of diaspora and migration. So you are not only making one measurement but three measurements. You are calculating the density of homeland as an imaginary, the signifiers related to home, and the signifiers related to homelessness, and you are then again measuring the thematic binary in the narrative structure. So whenever you are studying the narrative structure of a post-colonial diasporic text, you are making three measurements without probably till now realizing that you are measuring like a scientist only. Now let's look into the essentials of measurement. These are the essential features of getting your measurement correct. Number one, you not only have to make observations of your recorded data and measure them, but you will also have to measure whether your measurement is accurate or not. So this is some kind of a meta measurement that when you are making a research methodology correct, you have to check whether you are measuring, and then you will have to check whether what you are measuring has been measured correctly or not. So one has to test if he or she is measuring what he or she is to measure, number one. And number two, if all the samples are proportionate and faithful to the population. For example, let's take the case of number A. One has to test if he or she is measuring what he or she is meant to measure. Suppose you are working on borderliness in folk culture of a district. Now, when you say borderliness, you cannot accommodate a singular element of focus which has no connection with border. All the things that you study in that particular research, all the measurements over the years, over genres of rituals and performances, over genres of songs maybe, over genres of puppetry and dramatic histrionics, whatever be your chapterization, you have to see that the element that you are studying in a chapter that has been recorded, that has been observed, is connected some way directly to borderliness as an experience. If it is not an utterance of borderliness, you are making your measurements, but you are not measuring what you were about to measure. What you promised to measure, you are measuring something else, and that measurement is correct as a measurement, but you are measuring something which you are not meant to measure, which you promised to measure, which you defined as your measurement target. So you are losing accuracy in that case. If you are doing a research on borderliness in folk cultures of a particular district, and then you are studying, even if in one chapter, something that has no connection with borderliness. Number two, that the samples. What is a sample? A sample is a subset or a part of the entire target population which would be representative, although smaller in size, to the entire population. So whatever you conclude about the smaller part chosen will representatively be also accurate for the entire target population. Now, if you are looking into, for example, the place of traffic jam in literature, if this is your research area, then definitely you cannot pick up every film's, every play's, every single bit of surrealist poetry, and every single bit of every single line of every single page of every single country of every single novel. So you will have to choose, for example, I think one text from Adelaide, one text from Kolkata or New Delhi, one text or two texts from London, one text from Manhattan, and then you can, of course, tell that these are representing the different continents, the urban experiences of traffic jam in literary and cultural outputs of different metropolitan spaces. So that is called sampling, that you cannot choose every object defined by your research area, so you take a representative subset and you observe things from them, and they are representative. The conclusions that you derive from them are expected to be accurate for the entire population which you could not study. Now this is what you need to measure, that the samples are proportionate and faithful to the population. I'll give you one example of losing accuracy. Although your measurements are correct, you have not made the measurement of your measurement, whether you didn't measure whether your measurement is accurate or not. For example, suppose you are working on ecofeminism and postmodernism. The point is, all the samples that you are taking must be ecofeminist texts, and they must be postmodern texts. So if you choose a text there which is very famous but not either by chronology or by attributes a postmodern text, however great might it be for ecofeminism, your sample has been chosen wrongly. So you have to check whether your samples are faithful to the population, but that is easier to check. We do not need any measurement for that. But you will also have to check whether the samples are proportionate to the entire population. For example, if you are working on democracy in Indian writing in English, the point is the concept of democracy has so many different interpretations to so many people, ranging from wise to beggar, from rich to the pauper, from the ultra-masculine to the ultra-feminine. What is democracy? There is no singular answer to it. So if you are choosing your samples with one particular definition, and that is your definition or the definition that your supervisor obstinately clings to, your samples are not proportionate to the entire population, and there is no accuracy in the data that you record, and therefore there is almost no validity in the inferences that you make, because in clinging to one particular definition of democracy and by clinging to one particular perception of what democracy is, you had overlooked 99% of the entire population, and you mistook inaccurately only the texts that represent that particular notion of democracy to be representative and proportionate to the entire population of texts that deal with democracy, which it doesn't actually. So this is why you need to have, however qualitatively, a cross-checking or a cross-verification or a cross-measurement that the recorded data that you have measured, you have to again measure the process of that recording as correct or incorrect, as accurate or not accurate. But the more important aspect is, of course, reliability of your measurement. You make a measurement, and then based on that measurement, where you got your sense of, more or less intensity or absence, condensation or scattering, increment and descendancy, everything correct. Still, you have to see whether the measurement has been reliable. And what is reliability? Reliability means repeatability, that if you repeat this research with texts produced after a certain time interval of similar nature, similar authorhood, similar genre, similar ideological bracket, whether the inferences would remain the same or not. Suppose you take one particular century, let's say 19th century, and you want to do research on the role of nature in 19th century texts. So you have to understand that your observations and your inferences should be valid if you are measuring with the earliest decade of 19th century, which is the orthodox senior batch of romantic poetry, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Blake, whether the same results can be seen, whether the same measurement is reflected when you repeat in the next chapter with the junior batch of romantics, and that is Shelley, Keats, and Byron, whether the same results are obtained, whether the measurement is still consistent if you are testing it with the early Victorians, and whether they are again consistent when in the next to next chapter you are observing and measuring data from the late Victorians. If not, then you have to curb your time period, because you can't have randomly variant observations. Then you cannot prove any of the hypothesis to be your discovered measurement. So what is reliability? Reliability means consistency or repeatability of the data that you observe, and for that there are three types of measurement tests. These three are called test-rated method, alternative form method, and split-halves method. These are three different measurement tests to test whether the measurement that you are making, they are reliable or not. The test-rated method is very simple, and that is the same test will be repeated with a gap in time or a gap in space or a change of genre. So after a certain number of temporal, after a certain amount of spatial, or a certain degree of generic intervals, if you are measuring with newer samples whether the inferences and the observations on which the inferences were based produce the same data, produce the same sense, produce the same amount of knowledge, produce the same type of conclusions that you can make. So, for example, you are doing a work on monstrosity in homosexual literature. Suppose this is your research area. Then, of course, what you need to do is that until and unless there is a very clearly indicated, very narrow time span named in your title, it is to be demanded from the research scholar that whatever observations and whatever inferences are achieved from, obtained from early Gothic texts, like ranging from Castle of Otranto in 1764 to, let's say, Dracula by Bram Stoker. If you repeat the same research questions on newer samples from, let's say, the postmodern neo-vampiric texts like the Twilight Saga or the originals, or the Vampire Diaries, or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or Lucifer, you will get the same observations and same measurements and same inferences. If not, then your discovery isn't reliable enough. So you have to make the same test. That is why chapters are there, to the same observations, but after some time. That means, let's say, a change of period or change of decade within the scope of your research, of course, or change of century or change of year. So if you repeat the tests, you get the same observations, then it's reliable. You don't get the same observations, then your data isn't reliable. You can again, if temporal variation is not possible, you can again look into spatial variety, like you can repeat the same test. Suppose in the first chapter you look into North American texts, then in the second chapter you can look into texts from the Indian subcontinent, and in the third chapter, within the thematic limitations of your work, you can repeat it in case of African writing in English. So that is what is called spatial variation. And generic variation, suppose, as I said, that your research topic was simply this: monstrosity and homosexuality in literature, then of course you will have to take the same measurement and look for the same type of observations for reliability by repeating the same research questions on first the samples derived from novel, then samples derived from verse, poetry, and then samples derived from stage texts like drama and theater, and sample chosen from scopophilic forms like cinema and TV series and Netflix. So you have to repeat the same test on different genres. If they are giving you the core discovered measurement, the core part of your inferences to be intact, no matter however heterogeneized your samples maybe, then your discovery is reliable, it has a kind of universal truth, and it can be passed as a discovery of a new fact, which is the criterion of course, awarding a PhD technically. And the alternative form method. In alternative form method, you measure the same attribute, let's say monstrosity, but you measure that attribute more than once, but each time with a different measure or criterion of that same concept. So if you were writing the first chapter where you have recorded the data of understanding monstrosity as physical deformity, then physical deformity, physical ugliness, was a teratological measure, was a measurement of monstrosity, and you understood by monstrosity monstrous physicality, and you have chosen your samples and you had done the measurement, which is the recording, observation and recording leading to inferences. Next chapter, which means the next time you are testing the consistency of your research, you measure the same attribute, and that is monstrous, but this time you do not take physical deformity to be a marker of monstrosity, but you take political violence, political aggression, political destabilization and endangering factors for the stability of the status quo of society to be the definition of, to be the criterion of, to be the measure of monstrous. So what did you do in the first chapter? As monstrosity, you identified physical deformity, and so physical deformity was a measurement of monstrosity. The more physically deformed, the more physically teratologized in its abnormalcy some creature is, some individual is, the more monstrous that was. So physical monstrosity was the measurement of monstrosity in the first chapter, but political monstrosity becomes the measure of the same attribute called monstrosity in the second chapter. And if your results are same, if your data and if your measurements and if your inferences are same for the two chapters, then your research is having reliability. And this test method of choosing two different measures of monstrosity, number one in the first chapter, physical monstrosity, and number two, political monstrosity. This is alternative form method because you are measuring the same attribute monstrosity more than once, but each time with a different measure of the same concept of monstrosity. The first measure was physical monstrosity, and the second is political monstrosity. And this is the most interesting and the most useful test for measurement in literary and cultural studies, where repeatability or consistency is not easily seen, as in case of predictable behavior of physical inanimate objects in a laboratory of physics or chemistry. We cannot have in the cultural and literary expressions and behavior of unpredictable creatures like human beings that amount of predictability, that amount of consistency if you are repeating the test. So it's always important to have a method like the split-halves method. Here, more than one measures of a concept are tested together at the same time. So this means that if you are, suppose for example, if you are looking into monstrosity, and one measure of monstrosity is of course physical abnormalcy. Another measure may be sexual aggressiveness. Another measurement can be defiant and pervert behavior, and whatever is stereotypized in society, in mainstream dominant ideology of the society. For example, homosexuality will be seen as defiant, lesbianism would be seen as defiant, different types of philia would be seen as defiant, and these would be identified as a measure of monstrosity. So they will be measured, they will be recorded from the same text. So you are choosing the same texts at the same time, and your samples are drawn, that they remain constant. But in the first chapter you are looking into physical deformity as a measure of monstrosity. In the second, you are looking into sexual aggressiveness as a monstrosity. In the third, you are looking into perversion, or so-called perversion or deviation from norms as monstrosity. And in the fourth, maybe you are looking into anarchists, communists, hippies as monstrosity. So you take four different measures of the same concept of monstrosity, and in four different chapters with the same different texts, you find the presence, absence, growth, shrinkage, concentration, scattering of these measures. That is called a split-halves method for understanding such a complex phenomenon like the literary and cultural world, or any element in that world, like an expression or an ism, or a kind of worldview, or a kind of point of view, or kind of an aesthetic technique, or a kind of literary movement. It's very important that we adapt as many measures of the same concept as possible, and then we test the reliability of our research, reliability of our observation, by just checking whether we have repeated the research question on the samples before coming to conclusion. We have repeated with intervals, the intervals of different possible synonyms or measures of the same concept which is defined in our research topic. So if you are looking into a kind of research on manimals, now you see one measure of manimal is of course something manufactured by a mad scientist, like Frankenstein's monster or the creatures in the island of Dr. Moreau. So the scientifically, artificially manufactured hybrids between man and beast would be manimals. That is one measure, and this will be checked in the first chapter. Then of course you can look into the mythic miracles that are there in the legends, in the myths, in the epics. in the religious texts. For example, Ganesha in case of India, or Minotaurus in case of Greece. And they are half man and half animal, so that is a different measurement, because the mythically constructed man-animal hybrids will be a different measure from the scientifically laboratory-based arbitrary hybrids between man and beast. And then if you look into another type of horizon, and that is the cartoon superheroes, that are most often a blend between a human and an animal entity. For example, Spider-Man, or for example, Ant-Man, or for example, Batman. There would be a kind of blend between man and animal, but this is a different horizon together. So if you are looking into the cartoon superheroes, then by manimal you are meaning cartoon superheroes. You can also look into fables and comic strips where the animals talk. They are called phatic animals, P-H-A-T-I-C, because they can speak. They are not aphasic, so they speak in human language. So previously we are looking into man being blended uh, into bodies and behaviors of animal creatures. But what about the animals approaching the limit of human habits, like speaking, like Snowy in Tintin? That is also a hybrid between man and animal, because it is speaking in English, and original text is of course speaking in Belgian French, and in the Ananda publisher's version it's speaking in Bengali, like the reader and like Tintin himself. So we can take the different measures of the same concept of manimal. The first measure will be the measurement of scientifically manufactured manimals, and then the mythic miracles like Ganesha. And then we can have another different measure like cartoon superheroes like Batman and Spider-Man. And of course we can have phatic animals like the dogs that would speak in human language, or Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse. So that is called split-halves method, because here the same concept is tested at the same time, let's say early 20th century, but they are tested in different chapters with different measures or operational definitions of that concept. So what is meant by manimal in first chapter and what is meant by manimal in second chapter, they are different measures altogether. But this is a very, very intriguing but interesting way of getting your reliability checked. Now let's come to the last part of measurement. We have to not only measure, but we have to understand whether our measurement has validity or not. One part of it is connected to the question of accuracy, and that is we are measuring what it is supposed to measure. So we started by saying that we are doing research on borderliness in folk culture of a district, and then we cannot indulge into talking about things which are not connected to the experience of the border at all, however prominent that genre might be in that district. So we have to measure what it is supposed to measure, otherwise there is no accuracy, we have seen, and there is no validity to the data, because it will not be valid to the borderly experience. It will be valid to something else, but not to the research object. The second thing is the correspondence between measure and the concept. This is very important, that what we are measuring, the variable, let's say presence of first person singular number pronoun in texts of women writers, that actually has any connections with feminism or not. So what we are measuring, the variable, and what the concept of our research question was, they must be intrinsically connected. Otherwise, it is not valid. So we must again measure whether there is any correlation or correspondence between what we are measuring, the variable, and the concept that was defined in the research question. That there are three types of testing validity or measuring validity possible for literature and cultural studies students. One is called phase validity. And as you can understand from the name, that we understand by phase validity of measurement, something will be measured in the name of the concept. Some variable will be measured which is essential or germane to the concept. For example, if we are measuring monstrosity as our concept, then one measurement of monstrosity is how many times that creature identified as monster indulges in some form of aggressive violence not expected from a human being. So that has a phase validity because it is essential or germane to the concept of monstrosity that the monstrous is monstrous, because the concept of monstrous is identified as the concept of monstrous because the variable called number of times it indulges in violence not expected from a human being is essential to the definition of monstrosity. So it is kind of a phase validity, and you can of course check that whether you have that or not in your research. The second type of testing validity is called content validity. And by content validity, we mean that the concept will be single, but the understanding of the concept, the content of that signifier will be many, and we will observe data for each or as many of these contents or semantic contents of that signifier as possible. For example, if the signifier in your research is monstrosity or democracy, you can understand that monstrosity has so many different meanings at so many different contexts, and democracy has so many meanings to different points of view and different types of ideological camps to which the researcher or the character in the text or the author or in general anyone can belong to. So because there is this variation in the semantic content of the signifier called democracy or monstrosity, when we are doing research with these concepts like democracy or monstrosity, we have to accommodate as many different contents and check whether for each of these contents the same results are drawn. So instead of measuring monstrosity directly, we may measure physical beastliness in the first chapter, because physical beastliness is a content of the signifier. Monstrous. Sexual deviation from expected or standard norms, we can measure that instead of observing and measuring monstrosity directly. Political is something which is thought by the establishment to be dangerous, to be menacing, to be destabilizing. That can be measured in the third chapter, because even that is identified as a monster. So instead of measuring monstrosity directly, we are measuring in the first chapter physical beastliness, in the second chapter excessive deviation from expected standard norms of sexuality, and in the third chapter excessive threat perception or objects that evoke that threat perception to political status quo. So we are measuring three different contents as variables, but all of these contents as variables are finally giving you the measurement of monstrosity, which is not directly measured in your research anywhere. Now, this is called content validity. And what is constructed validity? By constructed validity, it means that first in the introduction chapter, beyond any doubt, you establish by logic, theory, and argument and instances a constructed synonymity between two different things. And then for measuring one thing which cannot be directly measured, you start measuring the other thing which you have already established in your introduction to be having a direct link with what you are meant to measure. Let me give you one example. For example, good and bad. You cannot measure good and measure bad. But you can always link in your definition to be questioning what is imposed and not explained. To be questioning what is imposed and not explained is good. Because by this criterion, Newton was good when apple fell on his head. Einstein was good when he destabilized the so-called binary opposition between energy and matter. Archimedes was good when he went to the bathtub before bursting forth into gymnophiliac eureka. So, you see, to be asking questions before accepting is good. Now, this is a constructed link. It is not a direct part of good. You are constructing this link with arguments, with theory in your introduction. And then since you cannot measure good directly from texts, but you can always measure the instances. You can always observe and record as data the instances, the number of times, the frequency of occurrence, the intensity, etc. of characters asking questions. Let's say Jane are asking questions about the red room before accepting it. You can always measure that, but you have already constructed it to be a link or tributary towards the idea or concept of good. So you are actually measuring a variable called number of occurrences. A character asks questions before accepting anything. So you can always measure that, and you are measuring that variable. You are not measuring good directly, but this has been already established as a constructed link in your introduction to be working inside this research as a defined symptom of good. So although you are measuring something else, you are actually deriving the measurement of good without measuring good directly in the text. So that is constructed validity of measurement. I have tried to make this lecture as lucid as possible because first and foremost there is just like there was once a superstition which believed that sun moves around the earth, although it was not true, just a superstition. There is this widely popular superstition, and people are very arrogant about them because little learning is a very dangerous thing, that we do not have any measurement in literary subjects like English studies, which is not true. I think I have broken your allergy or superstition, and I have shown you that actually all the time you are doing research, you are doing measurement. I'm just giving you, and research methodology course just gives you a systematic algorithm for defining your variables which you will observe in an accurate way, in a valid way, so that they represent your concepts. Because in the literature you ask questions about concepts, but concepts cannot be measured, concepts cannot be observed directly, concepts cannot be recorded as data. But variables which are either synonymous to that concepts essentially, or by content or by constructed link, they can be measured. And we all the time we are talking about growth of feminism, we are talking about growth, decline of imagism, we are talking about decline. Emily Bronte is more poetic than Charlotte Bronte. We're talking about more. So we are all the time talking about amount and magnitude, and perceptions derive from magnitude and sense of magnitude, but we never acknowledge that we are measuring. But actually, whatever your research question is, even in literary studies, you are finally measuring. So it's important to write the thesis in a way that the measurement has been defined, its accuracy has been checked, tests of reliability have been conducted. That's why we have different chapters to have intervals of consistency checked, and of course its validity be established. Thank you.